And my first guest tonight needs no introduction, so I won't bother with one. It's John Cleese.
And I went in, I sat on the bed, lay down, and I sort of looked at the screen, and I lost it.
The comedy legend who made millions laugh now spends his golden years desperately working stand-up gigs just to survive. At 85, John Cleese sits alone in his modest flat, surrounded by faded photos of dead friends, forced to tell the same old jokes night after night, because his ex-wives took everything. But why does a man who created Monty Python live like this? What terrible choices led him here? Join us as we find out how John Cleese now lives. Comedy legend, working to survive. The man who made the world laugh with dead parrots and silly walks now tells those same jokes night after night because he has no choice. John Cleese, at 85, should be sitting in a comfortable chair somewhere, enjoying the fruits of decades of comedy genius. Instead, he's on stage again, performing for crowds who expect the hits while he counts the money he needs to survive. Fame doesn't always mean fortune, and Cleese learned this lesson the hard way. While singers like Paul McCartney built empires worth hundreds of millions, comedians like Cleese discovered a painful truth about their chosen profession. The difference between a famous singer and a famous comedian, he once noted with his trademark dry wit, is about $200 million. Musicians own their songs forever, collecting royalties each time someone plays their music. Comedians tell jokes once, and that's it. The laughter fades, but the bills keep coming. The real destroyer of Cleese's wealth wasn't a bad investment or a failed business venture. It was love, or rather, the expensive endings of love. 4 marriages shaped his life, and 3 divorces nearly destroyed his bank account. His first wife, Connie Booth, shared his creative world. Together, they wrote Fawlty Towers, creating television magic while building a life that included their daughter Cynthia. Even after their divorce, they remained friends and finished the show's 2nd season together, proving that some partnerships survive even when marriages don't. Barbara Trentham came next, an American actress who gave him his 2nd daughter, Camilla. Their marriage lasted 9 years before ending in 1990, but it was his 3rd marriage that delivered the financial blow he still feels today. Alice Faye Eichelberger, an American psychotherapist, became his wife in 1992. When they divorced in 2008, she walked away with £12 million in assets and cash, plus £600,000 a year for 7 years. The settlement felt like a cruel joke to Cleese. She got 2 properties, one in London and one in New York, while he had to sell 3 others just to pay the bills. The unfairness stung him deeply. He realized that if they both died tomorrow, her children would inherit more than his kids. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a man who had spent decades making people laugh, now discovering that divorce court was the one place where his humor couldn't save him. Then came Jennifer Wade, his 4th wife, a jewelry designer, 53 years old when they married in 2012. She brought him something he thought he'd never find again: genuine happiness. After what he called decades of train wrecks in his romantic life, this 4th marriage became his sanctuary. At 85, he speaks of her with a gratitude that feels both touching and sad. She gave him peace, but she couldn't give him back his financial security. The money troubles mean retirement remains a fantasy. While other men his age sit in gardens or play with grandchildren, Cleese travels from city to city, performing his comedy routines because he simply can't afford to stop. The irony cuts deep. The man who created some of television's most beloved characters now lives like a traveling salesman, selling his past to pay for his present. But money isn't his only loss. The address book of his life keeps shrinking. Jeffrey Palmer, the perfect foil in so many sketches, gone. Joan Sanderson, the demanding hotel guest who tormented Basil Fawlty, gone. Bernard Cribbins, Ken Campbell, and countless others who filled his professional world with laughter, all gone. When he started writing his book about faulty towers, he found himself checking name after name, wondering who was still alive. The answer was always the same: dead. This parade of loss feels like what writer Philip Roth called a massacre. Cleese understands now that nothing prepares you for your 80s. The friends disappear faster than you can process the grief. The realization hits like a physical blow. You're not just getting older, you're becoming the last man standing in a world that once felt crowded with familiar faces. These losses sent him back to therapy, something he'd done on and off throughout his life. This time, he's looking for a Jungian analyst, someone who understands the psychology of life's second half. Carl Jung wrote extensively about aging and approaching death, and Cleese feels ready to face those conversations. At 85, he's more aware of mortality than ever before, but he's not running from it. Instead, he meets death the way he's always met life's challenges, with dark humor. The same black comedy that gave us the dead parrot sketch now helps him process his ending. He jokes about his epitaph, hoping people will remember him as reasonably kind rather than brilliantly funny. The man who built a career on making others laugh now finds his greatest comfort in the quiet moments with his wife, away from the spotlight that still demands his presence. So, how does a man facing financial ruin in his 80s create comedy that still makes teenagers laugh today? Cleese's Python years. The answer is in the strangest creative experiment in television history. Monty Python's flying circus didn't follow any rules because nobody in the group believed in rules. 6 men sat around a table in the late 1960s, and nobody was the boss. Nobody had the final say. Nobody pulled rank or made executive decisions. This wasn't a business meeting or a writer's room in any traditional sense. It was democracy run riot, as Cleese himself described it. Graham Chapman, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam, Eric Idle, Terry Jones, and Michael Palin would read their sketches aloud to each other. If people laughed, the sketch went in the show. If they didn't laugh, it didn't. That simple test became their only rule. The system worked because they weren't trying to prove a point or push an agenda. They were simply chasing laughter like children chasing butterflies. When they later created Life of Brian, their masterpiece about a man mistaken for a religious figure, they discovered something powerful. All 6 men agreed on what religion wasn't, even though they couldn't agree on what it should be. Their shared skepticism became their creative fuel. Comedy writers have always worked in pairs, and Cleese understood why. 2 minds building on each other's ideas create something neither could reach alone. The process feels almost magical when it works. One person says something, the other mishears it or twists it, and suddenly a new idea emerges that's better than either original thought. Sometimes the best comedy comes from complete misunderstandings between collaborators. Cleese learned that there are no mistakes in creative work, only unexpected discoveries. A wrong turn during a writing session might lead to the perfect punchline. A misunderstood direction might create the sketch that defines your entire career. The Python team embraced this chaos, letting ideas bounce between them like pinballs in a machine designed by someone who'd never seen a pinball machine. The group's success puzzled even its creators. 50 years later, new generations still discover Python and fall under its spell. American teenagers watch 40-year-old sketches and laugh until they cry. College students quote lines from shows their parents watched. The appeal crosses not just generations, but cultures, languages, and completely different ways of seeing the world. Cleese believes the secret lies in Python's fundamental attitude. Everything is absurd. The show looked at politics, religion, social norms, and human behavior and declared it all ridiculous. Young people, especially, connect with this worldview because they often feel like they're living in a world run by adults who've lost their minds. Python permitted them to laugh at the madness instead of pretending it made sense. The comedy worked as a rebellion against inflexible thinking. A French philosopher named Henri Bergson once defined humor as social punishment for psychological rigidity. People laugh together at someone who can't adapt, who keeps behaving the same way even when circumstances change. Python's characters were almost always rigid people, failing to notice that their world had gone completely insane. This philosophy shaped every sketch. The dead parrot customer refuses to accept that his bird is deceased. The Ministry of Silly Walks official treats ridiculous leg movements as serious government business. The Spanish Inquisition interrupts normal conversations with elaborate torture equipment. The humor comes from watching inflexible people try to maintain their worldview, while reality crumbles around them. Years later, when Cleese earned an Oscar nomination for writing A Fish Called Wanda, he discovered something about his creative process. The script had gone through 13 drafts before he felt satisfied. Each revision made it tighter, funnier, and more precise. This methodical approach to perfection stood in sharp contrast to the improvisational comedy that was gaining popularity. Cleese never understood the appeal of improv. He saw it as a party trick, entertaining, but not particularly meaningful. The comedians he most respected were writers who crafted their material on paper, working and reworking until every word served the larger purpose. Improvisation felt loose and unfocused to him, lacking the dramatic structure that made comedy truly powerful. He recognized two types of perfectionism in his creative work. The healthy kind pushed him to make each performance as strong as possible, then let him review what went wrong and fix it for next time. The unhealthy kind would have made him obsess over every mistake, replaying failures until they poisoned future attempts. Great artists, he noticed, were obsessive about their work, but not destructive about their mistakes. This creative philosophy carried him through Python's chaotic democracy and beyond. The group that started with 6 equal voices eventually broke apart, but their approach to comedy changed everything that came after. They proved that laughter could be both silly and profound, that absurdity could reveal truth, and that the best comedy comes from collaborative chaos rather than corporate control. But after revolutionizing comedy with chaos and democracy, how did Cleese end up teaching corporate executives how to run meetings? The business empire. The transformation began with a phone call that would have sounded like a sketch idea to the old Python team. Tony Jay, who later became Sir Anthony Jay after writing the brilliant political comedies Yes, Minister and Yes, Prime Minister, had a peculiar proposition. He wanted Cleese to help him make training videos for business executives. Not comedy videos, training videos about management skills. Cleese had no qualifications for this venture whatsoever. He'd never run a company, never managed a team, never even worked in a traditional office environment. His entire career had been built on making fun of authority figures, not teaching people how to become them. But something about the absurdity of the situation appealed to him. The process revealed something fascinating about how expertise works. Jay would bring in Britain's top experts on subjects like conducting interviews, making decisions, and running effective meetings. These specialists knew their fields inside and out, but they couldn't make their knowledge stick with audiences. That's when Cleese and Jay discovered their secret weapon. Creativity made everything more memorable. When they added humor and storytelling to dry management principles, the marketplace responded immediately. Business executives, it turned out, were desperate for training that didn't put them to sleep. The collaboration taught Cleese that serious subjects became more serious when treated with the right kind of lightness. From this unlikely partnership, Cleese developed a leadership philosophy that would have made his Python colleagues proud. The ideal leader, he decided, should be trying to make himself indispensable. Instead of hoarding power and information, a good leader should teach everyone around him to do his job so well that he barely needs to show up. The goal was to minimize chaos during transitions and let the leader focus on big-picture thinking while everyone else handled the details. This approach flew in the face of traditional corporate culture, where managers often protected their positions by keeping subordinates dependent. Cleese's philosophy suggested that true leadership meant working yourself out of a job, at least the day-to-day parts of it. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd spent years mocking authority figures was now teaching authority figures how to give away their authority. The business training work also taught him about the cultural divide in professional humor. American companies, he noticed, were more comfortable with direct, aggressive sales approaches. A hard sell felt normal in American business culture. But in Britain and most of Europe, executives preferred a warmer, more humorous atmosphere around their products. They needed to create emotional connections before making their pitch. This cultural gap extended to office comedy itself. Cleese found himself navigating the delicate balance between spontaneity and sensitivity in workplace humor. He believed that decent people didn't need extensive rules about what they could joke about. But as workplaces became more diverse and legally cautious, the natural flow of humor became more complicated. The challenge intensified when it came to hierarchy and laughter. Cleese noticed that in large organizations, employees would watch their boss's face before deciding whether to laugh at a joke. This created an uncomfortable dynamic where genuine humor got filtered through power structures. He'd seen this phenomenon most clearly in Ottawa, where political audiences responded more slowly to comedy because everyone was checking everyone else's reactions before committing to laughter. The regional differences in American humor fascinated him more than the transatlantic divide. He observed that the real comedy gap wasn't between London and New York, but between America's literal-minded Midwest and the more ironic sensibilities of the coasts and Great Lakes regions. Kansas and Arkansas operated on fundamentally different comedic wavelengths than San Francisco and New York. These insights came from years of performing for corporate audiences, but Cleese's most memorable business experience had nothing to do with training videos. Early in his career, he'd attempted a brief stint at Newsweek magazine. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Spend a month learning how journalism worked from the inside. What happened next perfectly captured the absurdity that would later define his comedy career. After his assigned mentor got pulled away to other duties, Cleese found himself essentially abandoned in the newsroom. Nobody quite knew what to do with him. Finally, someone handed him what seemed like a reasonable assignment: write a preparatory obituary for Sukarno, the Indonesian president. The problem was that Sukarno appeared to be in perfect health. He was 35 years old and showed no signs of imminent death. Cleese realized he was being gently sidelined, given busy work that would keep him out of trouble while producing nothing of value. Rather than struggle through the awkward situation, he wrote a polite resignation letter to his editor, Bob Christopher, whom he genuinely liked and didn't want to put in the embarrassing position of having to fire him. The Newsweek episode showed Cleese how real-life institutions could be just as absurd as comedy sketches. Writing obituaries for living leaders, he found himself trapped in a system so dysfunctional it felt like satire. This experience shaped his view of the corporate world. Serious people creating unintentionally hilarious results. Cleese later turned that insight into training programs, using humor to highlight workplace absurdities. Beneath it all, he realized something simple but powerful. Those who thrive in professional life often do so by recognizing the nonsense around them and learning to laugh at it instead of being crushed by it. But before corporate training videos made him rich, one embarrassing family name nearly derailed his comedy career. What secret did his father hide? From cheese to Cleese. John Cleese was born into a world where his very name was a source of shame. His father, Reginald Francis Cleese, carried a secret that would shape the future comedy legend's understanding of identity and embarrassment from birth. The family name wasn't Cleese at all. It was Cheese. When Reginald enlisted in the army during World War I, he was so mortified by his surname that he simply started using Cleese instead. He made it official by deed poll in 1923, 2 years before his son was born. The boy who would become Britain's most famous comedy export grew up in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, as the only child of an insurance salesman and his wife, Muriel. His childhood was marked by an unusual dynamic: a father who had reinvented himself out of embarrassment, and a mother who would live to be 101 years old, dominating her son's emotional life for decades. Even as an adult, Cleese would describe his ingrained habit of walking on eggshells around his mother, a pattern that would poison his romantic relationships for years. Young Charnan found escape in the revolutionary world of radio comedy. The Goon Show, written by Spike Milligan and featuring Peter Sellers, became an obsession for him and his schoolmates. They would gather each morning to discuss the previous night's episode, rehashing jokes and analyzing the absurd humor that was reshaping British comedy. This show planted the seeds of the surreal, boundary-pushing comedy that would define Python decades later. His education began at St. Peter's Preparatory School, paid for by money his mother had inherited. Even then, he showed the sharp mind that would later dissect human behavior with surgical precision. He excelled at English and surprised everyone by doing well at cricket and boxing, physical pursuits that seemed unlikely for a boy who was already over 6 feet tall by age 13. At Clifton College, the expensive public school in Bristol, Cleese's rebellious streak emerged alongside his academic brilliance. He allegedly painted footprints on the school grounds to make it appear that the statue of Field Marshal Earl Haig had left its plinth to use the toilet. This wasn't just teenage mischief, it was the early work of a mind that would spend its life exposing the absurdity of authority figures and sacred institutions. Academically, he was formidable. He passed 8 O-levels and 3 A-levels in mathematics, physics, and chemistry while playing cricket in the first 11. But it was a moment of perceived injustice at age 17 that crystallized his worldview. When his housemaster failed to make him a house prefect, something shifted permanently in young Cleese's mind. In his autobiography, he would write that this moment changed his perspective on the world. It wasn't fair, and therefore it was unworthy of his respect. This revelation about fairness and authority would echo through everything he created. From the Ministry of Silly Walks to Basil Fawlty's manic episodes, Cleese's comedy would always target the pompous, the inflexible, and the arbitrarily powerful. That teenage disappointment became the foundation of a comedy philosophy that would make millions laugh while exposing the absurdity of human institutions. The path to Cambridge wasn't straightforward. National service had ended, creating twice the usual number of university applicants. So Cleese returned to his preparatory school for 2 years to teach science, English, geography, history, and Latin. This teaching experience would surface years later in Life of Brian, when he corrected Brian's badly written Latin graffiti, a moment that perfectly captured his pedantic precision, wrapped in absurdist humor. When he finally reached Downing College, Cambridge, to read law, Cleese discovered the Cambridge Footlights. The story of his audition reveals everything about his character. When asked if he could sing or dance, he replied no. He'd been banned from singing at school because he was so terrible, and his dancing was even worse. When asked what he could do, he gave the answer that would define his life: "I make people laugh." At Footlights, Cleese found his people. He worked with Tim Brooke Taylor, Bill Oddie, and met Graham Chapman, his future writing partner and a key figure in Monty Python. He contributed to the 1961 review, became registrar the next year, and graduated in 1963 with an upper second. Still, his father sent him job ads for management roles, unable to accept comedy as a serious path. This divide, creative drive versus parental expectation, stayed with Cleese. His father saw comedy as beneath him, and Cleese struggled with that view. His strained bond with his mother shaped his adult relationships, fueling insecurity and years of therapy. His spiritual outlook, skeptical but open, left him searching for meaning beyond traditional religion. Perhaps most tellingly, Cleese developed an unexpected passion for lemurs, creatures he described as extremely gentle, well-mannered, and great fun. A species was even named after him, the Bimaraha woolly lemur, or Cleese's woolly lemur. In a moment of characteristic dark humor, he once said he should have married one instead of struggling through his disastrous relationships with women. It was a joke, but like all of Cleese's best humor, it contained a kernel of painful truth about a man who could make the world laugh, but couldn't quite figure out how to be happy himself. But decades of making people laugh came with a price. Could the man who mastered humor survive in a world that forgot how to laugh? The final battle. Fame became John Cleese's beautiful prison. Everywhere he went, strangers approached him to recite the Dead Parrot sketch or quote lines from Fawlty Towers. He learned to nod and smile when fans performed his material back to him, sometimes badly, sometimes with genuine affection. If it happened twice a day, he could handle it. The repetition was manageable, but behind the polite responses, something was wearing thin. The constant demand to be the character people remembered rather than the man he had become. The weight of his jokes began to haunt him. Looking back at his Python work, Cleese found moments that made him wince. There was the cruel joke about David Hemmings, a decent actor they had mocked in the credits by writing that he appeared by permission of the National Forestry Commission, implying his acting was wooden. It was clever wordplay, but it was also mean-spirited, and Cleese knew it. The joke revealed something uncomfortable about comedy's power to wound, especially when wielded by someone with his platform and influence. Technology brought new ways to make old mistakes. In 2014, Cleese found himself in the center of a Twitter storm over a comment about Oscar Pistorius. The misunderstanding was almost absurd in its simplicity. He had been talking to his television repairman while his social media manager was on the phone. The repairman made a joke about Pistorius being legless, and Cleese sarcastically told his manager they should tweet it, meaning exactly the opposite. The sarcasm didn't land. The tweet went out, the backlash hit hard, and though Cleese apologized right away, the damage was done. The controversy over the Fawlty Towers Germans episode cut deeper than most. When the BBC pulled it from streaming, Cleese felt people had completely missed the point. The episode wasn't mocking Germans, it was mocking Basil Fawlty's outdated obsession with World War II. Basil, stuck in the past, embarrasses himself while the German guests remain calm and polite. The joke was always on him, not them, but the satire got lost in modern outrage. To Cleese, this moment reflected a larger issue. People were reacting without understanding context. Comedy was no longer judged by its meaning, but by its potential to offend. And that, for him, was deeply troubling. He had been satirizing Britain's inability to move on, poking at how the country clung to its finest hour as a symbol of past relevance. In the episode, the Germans were polite and composed. Basil, on the other hand, was ridiculous. The joke was always on him. But that nuance was lost. And for Cleese, it symbolized a much larger cultural shift. Comedy was being judged by people who couldn't or wouldn't understand context. What began as a push for kindness had turned into something else. An environment where comedians felt trapped, where creativity was choked by fear. He was especially disillusioned with the BBC. The network he once admired had become a place run by cautious executives, not creators. Decisions came from fear, not vision. Pulling the Germans episode felt like the final straw, proof that courage had left the building. To him, cancel culture wasn't just a threat to comedy. It was a threat to the very idea of public discourse. It treated words as dangerous, regardless of meaning or intent. But humor had always relied on ambiguity, on exploring the absurdity of human behavior. Stripping away that freedom killed the spark that made comedy matter. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who built his legacy skewering rigid authority now found himself defending humor from a new kind of authoritarianism, one that masked control as sensitivity. The faces had changed, but the silencing felt the same. By his 80s, Cleese saw all of this as a deeper cultural problem. Society had become so afraid of causing pain that it avoided truth entirely. But comedy had never been about safety. It was about honesty. It helped people face the dark with a laugh. Take that away, and you don't get progress. You get fragility. The attacks on his work and the work of his generation felt personal because they were personal. Critics weren't just rejecting his comedy. They were rejecting the idea that comedy could be a force for social good, that laughter could bring people together rather than divide them. They had forgotten that the best humor came from a place of humanity, not hatred, and that the ability to laugh at ourselves was one of the most important skills a healthy society could possess. But perhaps the most profound shift in Cleese's thinking wasn't about comedy at all. In his final years, he began to realize that none of his professional achievements mattered as much as the quality of his relationships. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, he didn't mention Python or faulty towers. He hoped people would say his friends thought he was reasonably kind. Everything else, the fame, the awards, the cultural impact, was just an amusing way to pass the time. The man who had made millions laugh was learning that the most important audience was the smallest one. The people who knew him not as a comedy legend, but as a friend, a father, a husband, trying to figure out how to live well in a world that had grown strange around him. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out another interesting video by clicking on the video shown on your screen. See you on the other side.